So you may be familiar with the new British Medical Journal article that came out chronicling the story of Brooke Jackson, who worked on the phase 3 Pfizer vaccine trials and saw a number of things that were concerning to her, reported it to the FDA, and the FDA seemed to respond by saying they weren't going to look into these issues any further. Now, there was a number of issues associated with this Pfizer vaccine trial, according to Jackson. Inside the British Medical Journal article, it reads, "A regional director who was employed at the research organization Ventavia Research Group has told the BMJ that the company falsified data, unblinded patients, employed inadequately trained vaccinators, and was slow to follow up on the adverse events reported in Pfizer's pivotal phase 3 trial." Here to help us break this down is Dr. Madhava Setty. Madhava, when you see what's going on in this story, what comes to mind to you? What are some of the key points?
Well, the biggest thing right from the get-go is that these are huge accusations. And we have to ask ourselves as journalists or as researchers, should we take what the British Medical Journal is saying about Brooke Jackson's story seriously? And this is where we need to sense make. And the very first thing we have to say is, like, this is coming not from a independent news platform out of Canada. This is actually coming from the British Medical Journal. No offense, Joe. But no, we're trying to do our best here, and this is part of journalism, is who is reporting it. This is why we take our integrity so seriously here at The Pulse. So it's coming from the BMJ. Number two, the events that are being reported on here happened over a year ago. So it's not like she said something last week and showed up at their studios and suddenly she has a platform. This clearly had been researched. I mean, the BMJ is not going to come forward with these kinds of stories unless they can back it up. And now this is where I would like to get into the nitty gritty as to where is the corroboration of some of the claims she's making. And I would say the most important things that she said had to do with the fact that research protocol was breached in terms of a number of, she brings up things like, well, the safety about the needles and other things. The real concern I have is that there was the potential unblinding of the investigators, which she goes into with detail in terms of, like, participants' actual information being left on charts that should not have been left there, so that the people who are actually giving the medicine, whether it be placebo or vaccine, knew what they were doing. That is an enormous problem if you're trying to do a blinded placebo-controlled study, which is what Pfizer was trying to do here. Once you take away the blinding, it's a completely different kind of study. That's the first thing. The second thing is that she's saying that Ventavia, this clinical trial research company, was targeting personnel for reporting on these kinds of issues. So this is important because if it's true, then this could be a larger problem that happened across other sites.
Yeah, just to note on that, I mean, after she reported these issues, she was fired later that same day, which is, that's kind of the case in point there.
Correct. So exactly. So that was how did the problems end as soon as she was fired? Right? I don't think so. But here she had 15 years of research as a director of trials, or at least a regional director, and she was fired after 2 weeks. Right? You think she really did anything super wrong, or was it the fact that she notified the FDA when her supervisors did not respond or make any changes to their protocol or safety?
Yeah.
So can we say with 100% that she's telling the truth? No, we can't, right? We don't know that. Mm-hmm. But this is very, very important, because if we now take a closer look at her biggest claims, which were potential unblinding of the investigators, and the lack of concern around these issues, now we have something to go on. So what we're looking at right now is the Vaccine Emergency Use Authorization Review Memorandum, that came from Pfizer when they first were appealing the CDC and the FDA to approve, or not approve, but to authorize their vaccine on adults. And Table 2 is labeled Efficacy Populations, Treatment Groups as Randomized. And what I want to bring your attention to is the first two columns is the vaccine, the numbers of people who got the vaccine, and the numbers of people who got the placebo, okay? And as you go down, row by row, you see the very first thing is how many people were randomized, and there's about 21,820 in both groups. That's great. When you're running a trial, you want to have the vaccine group and the placebo group be about the same size, but also be matched. In other words, have the same sort of incidence of disease and all these other things, so that you can make adequate comparisons between the two to see how your drug or vaccine did. And in this particular table, they're breaking down who remained within the trial and who had to be pulled out. Row by row, we see that the numbers pretty much match each other. If you go down all the way to the bottom of the table, where we're looking for participants excluded from evaluable efficacy, 14 days. That's the part I'm looking at here. And we see that there's 1,790 in the vaccine group and 1,585 in the placebo group. Now, suddenly there's a difference of about 250 between the two. And what is that 250? Well, now we need to go down a little further, and it is in the comparison between these two columns. Had other important protocol deviations on or prior to 7 days after dose 2. In the vaccine column, there's 311 that were pulled from evaluable calculations. They were excluded, compared to 60. This is a 5 times difference in a number. And what we're talking about here is that they have decided, for whatever reason, at that point, to yank 311 people from their vaccine group around the time that they got their second dose, compared to only 60 with the placebo. The placebo group also had a second dose of placebo. That's how they blinded the study. So what does this mean? I don't know, because Pfizer did not explain what these protocol deviations are. Yet all of a sudden, we have a 5 times greater number of participants being extracted from the study right around the second dose. Mm-hmm. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it brings up questions like for what reason, like were these injuries they couldn't explain? Was it something completely different? Did it have something to do with the? She mentioned vaccinators not being trained properly. Did they not give a vaccine properly? Like, we're guessing.
Well, yes, we're guessing, and this is why it's like when we looked at this document, 8, 9, 10 months ago when it first came out and made public, that was a matter of concern for me. Like, what are these things? And the number of 250 is a tiny number compared to the number of total participants. But the number of total participants, around 40,000 or 44,000, has nothing to do with the calculation of the efficacy of the vaccine, right? Because this is the way you do a trial. You inoculate 20,000 people with the vaccine, 20,000 people with the placebo, and then you sit around and wait. And you wait for people to get sick. And then you count up how many sick people are on each wing, and then you come up with an efficacy calculation. That number is really small. There was only 170 people that came down with COVID in that trial of 44,000 people. And most of them, 20 times more, got the placebo, and that's how they came up with their efficacy number. But now we're dealing with an inexplicable number, around 250 people who were pulled out of the vaccine group after dose 2 with no explanation, compared to only 60 that were pulled at that point from the other group. Now this is not a smoking gun, but this is like, why were so many people pulled out of the vaccine group? And you're not telling us why. And it would not be such a matter of concern, except for the fact that there is now a potential for the unblinding of the investigators. Now, if the investigator is looking at someone who got a shot in their arm and they know what shot it was, this is potentially very damning in terms of the integrity of the data that's being used to calculate the efficacy of the vaccine. Ventavia has continued to remain on Pfizer's payroll to help them with their trials with the pediatric study, which I hope we're all following. It's a hair's breadth from being approved on 5 to 11-year-olds in this country. It has another step to go through with the CDC at this point. And let's look at what the Pfizer memorandum is that demonstrated what happened with the pediatric data. Did the same thing happen? As a matter of fact, it did. So this is the equivalent document. This is to the VRBPAC, the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Committee of the FDA. And this is the presentation that they gave to them last week. This is part of the study. And here again, it's the equivalent table with the pediatric population. You notice that the total number of participants is much tinier. It's only a total of 2,285. In the adult trial, we're looking at over 40,000 people. Keep that in mind, but I want to bring our attention to the row where we go down to dose 2. And it says, had other important protocol deviations on or prior to 7 days after dose 2. On or prior to 7 days after. So they had received their second dose, and they had important protocol deviations. Now, we would expect that the number of deviations would be the same in both the vaccine and placebo group, just like we talked about with the adults. They're not. They're not even close to being the same. It's 47 versus 4. Now, we have to understand something. First of all, in this particular study, there were more people getting the vaccine than the placebo. That's not necessarily a problem. You just adjust things by ratios. But we see that 47 people, or 47 children, had protocol deviations after the second dose. And 47 is about 3.1% of that group. Whereas in the placebo, there was only 4 children that had important protocol deviations. And that makes up 0.5%. That is a very, very large number of a difference between the two groups. That's inexplicable. Why is this happening? Why is it always happening in the 7-day window after dose 2? You know why? I don't. And here's what's important. Does Pfizer know? Probably. Did the FDA ask questions about this? No, they did not. This is an important piece of information that our investigatory committees should be asking, but they didn't. And the reason why I want to bring this up is that this is yet another allegation of Brooke Jackson, is that she called up the FDA. The FDA said, thank you for calling, and we can't tell you about how we're going to investigate it, but they never did. And when it came time to do site inspections, the FDA chose not to go to Ventavia, even though they had a direct communication with a whistleblower that said, look, there are protocol deviations here and you need to come check it out. But they chose not to.
And you know what's concerning about this is not only have you and I and what you've done on the Setty Report for the past several months talked a lot about data issues, and there's always been this this question of something seems to be finagled with the data in this Pfizer trial. Something seems to be wrong. Even before Brooke Jackson came out, you always alluded to that. And obviously there's the long history of pharma with, you know, corruption and so on and so forth, the revolving door between regulatory agencies and government. Like the writing is kind of on the wall in our past and in our history as to how and why, you know, a lot of this type of stuff can happen with manipulated data that ends up a product on the market. And like, should we really think here in COVID that anything's going to be any different? We can't sit here and say we know exactly what's going on with why these people got pulled out. However, we can sit here and know that they've been manipulating data as pharma for a very long time. And this could be the clue. Now, in terms of like layman's terms, do you have any thoughts, any insights people can think about as to what these deviations could have meant? Is there a simple explanation that everybody would accept as reasonable? Or like what could have happened? Why could these people have been pulled out?
Well, the difference here is that the vaccine that they're using it has to be thawed and prepared a certain way. So these kinds of steps aren't necessarily done with a placebo, which are probably just sitting around, in a vial. However, the reason why I continue to be suspicious is that why did this all happen after dose 2 and not dose 1? There was nothing like that with dose 1. All dose 2 is when you have this extraction of people from the vaccine pool. And this is actually mentioned as a potential reason why there was a difference in the pediatric group, but they don't tell us why it didn't happen with dose 1, nor was this even brought up with the adult trial. So there we have yet another example of it happening at dose 2, only dose 2, not dose 1, no explanation. And to answer your question, no, I have no idea. And what we have to do here as people who are trying to understand what's happening is consider the chances that all of the deviations from protocol happened primarily with the vaccine group and not the placebo group. That statistically, that's nearly impossible or extremely unlikely that all of a sudden that it's all happening only in the placebo group. They notice it, unless they know that they're dealing with a separate group of participants, people who got the vaccine. That's why it's so scary. And look, I'm making accusations here, but so is Brooke Jackson. And let's put these things together, and now we have a stronger argument for why we need to believe what is being reported in the BMJ.
So obviously one of the more troubling stories out of the Pfizer trials here was the story of Maddie Daguerre, the 12-year-old who's been permanently injured as a result of this. I mean, it's a really sad story, to be quite honest. We've covered it here on the Pulse. We'll put a link down in the description for people who want to learn more. But did her story show up in this trial? I mean, from what I understand, like the FDA is almost not even acknowledging the reality of her injury.
Yeah, well, that's the relevant point here, is that she was a trial participant, received the vaccine, was injured, and there's no record of her injury in the data. Yeah. And this points to something really nefarious going on. Yeah. When those are the most important things. Like, we're talking about our children here, the safety of our kids, with regard to this vaccination, and the injuries that are occurring are not being reported. I mean, this should be national news. Because that, one injury, makes a huge difference when even when you're talking about tens of thousands of children. That's how often it happens. Yeah. The studies are too small, and I'm speaking specifically about the pediatric study. There's not enough power in the studies to pick up these kinds of incidents, especially if Pfizer is allowed to exclude people.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And just for people who don't know, Maddie's story is very severe. We're not talking about something mild here. We're talking like this would have been a massive stain on the study as a whole, and here the FDA, and here it's just not even being talked about whatsoever. So I mean, this is a big deal, and who knows how many more of these there are. So yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to kind of follow up with a lot of what's going on with this particular Pfizer study, especially as new updates come. So be sure to subscribe to the channel and know everything we're doing here at the Pulse. Dr. Madhav Setty, thanks once again for a good Setty Report here as we dig through some of the more finer details of this whistleblower account.
Yeah, great to be with you, Joe. You're welcome, and thank you for listening and tuning in, everybody. Please leave your comments down. Let us know how I can do this better, and stay sharp and stay healthy, okay?
That's it. That's all.